I think I'll wait for the Melanies. Go ahead. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Susana Ruiz. I am faculty at UCSC's Film and Digital Media department, and welcome to the second session of the Sammy Showcase Research Talks. As you probably all know by now, of course, this is the first year that the Sammys have a program for research talks, where the extremely diverse research around games and play at UCSC is featured and shared, so that's a great thing. I really, right now, quick thank you to all those that made it happen. I hope it's the beginning of a great tradition. So this session is focused on game design, and as I think you'll get a sense of by the end of the session, is that game design is, I think, an inclusive practice. The designers on this panel draw from a wide variety of traditions, legacies, histories, frameworks, and desires. These 6 speakers are all graduate students at UCSC in either of 3 programs: computational media in the School of Engineering, the multidisciplinary digital arts and new media program, and the film and digital media department in the arts division. And to me, what is really heartening and exciting about this is that game design offers a context for these students, artists, and researchers from these very different programs to come together and learn and grow together. So since we're pressed for time, we'll start with our first speaker, who is Jordan Magnuson. I hope I'm saying that right, Magnuson? Yep. Okay. Jordan Magnuson is a current student in the DANAM program, Digital Arts and New Media MFA program. His work takes a close look at how meaning is crafted in games, especially in games that tackle complex emotions. He is already an accomplished independent video game maker, and today he's going to share with us his most recent work thinking about the relationship, or a relationship, between poetry and video games. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Susana. And thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the talks in this game design segment as well, and thanks so much to Melanie and everyone else who helped kind of put these talks together. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope this won't be too boring for some of you who are familiar with some of my thoughts. Noah laughs. I was going to do a brief introduction, but I don't think that's needed. These are some games I've made. I've been making experimental games for quite a while. But my creative practice, and what I want to talk about today, is that my creative practice has kind of led me down this peculiar path of looking at video games in relation to poetry. And I say peculiar path because when you mesh video games and poetry together, well, you don't get this, but you get maybe something like this in some kind of metaphorical way. One of my current hobbies is adapting quotes about poetry to be quotes about video games. And when you do that, you get things like words like this from Paul Engel. Game design is ordinary language raised to the nth power. Video games are boned with ideas, nerved and blooded with emotions, all held together by the delicate, tough skin of interaction. Or this from Ivan Boland. The subtlety, elegance, and hunger of the human spirit is obvious everywhere in video games, neither constrained by nor separable from the interactive components, bounding boxes, and digital assets that shelter them. Or from Dylan Thomas, one of my favorites, video games are what in a game makes you laugh, cry, prickle, be silent, makes your toenails twinkle, makes you want to do this or that or nothing, makes you know that you are alone in the unknown world, that your bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own. So there's something about these adapted quotes that I find strangely compelling, but also there's this strong sense of dissonance that's created for me by these quotes. And I think one reason for this dissonance is that video games and poetry have historically sort of had very different perspectives on the real. So as many people have pointed out, video games are entangled with technology, with the techno-utopian dream of hyper-realism, where reality is something like pixels plus physics, and so on. Poetry, meanwhile, tends to focus on and often present the invisible, the immaterial, and so there's these very different conceptions of what's real, what makes something real. I think another reason for the dissonance is that video games and poetry have historically had different, very different perspectives on the valuable. And again, as many people have pointed out, video games have been entangled pretty tightly with capitalism, with commodity culture, where there's a value on what sells, a value on utility, rationality, efficiency. Poetry, on the other hand, has tended to emphasize the mystical over the rational, process over efficiency, reflection over utilization. So I'd argue that these historical tendencies are significant, but at the same time, we can certainly point to video games and poetry that operate outside of these tendencies. So I think the more significant reason that the adapted quotes seem so dissonant is that we lack the language, we lack the frameworks to allow us to really conceive of video games as capable of being poetry. And so as we've studied how video games work expressively, how they create meaning, we've been concerned mainly with two perspectives. And not to beat a dead horse, but narratology and ludology. So of course, both of these perspectives have been, well, I say of course, maybe, I think of course, both of these perspectives have been very fruitful. But they've also left us kind of, I think, a bit trapped on a somewhat limiting spectrum, where video games can do story and video games can do gameplay, and now we're all very enlightened to know that they can do some combination, or maybe any combination of story and gameplay. But we're still kind of on the spectrum, and video games maybe can't do, when we're in this framework, can't do very much outside of story or gameplay. So I think we need more points of reference for thinking about meaning in video games. And that's where the idea of poetics comes in, or more specifically, a poetics of the lyric, which asks, what are the techniques, conventions, and strategies that video games can use to pursue poetic meaning, meaning that might fall a bit outside of a strict ludonarrative dichotomy. So let me give an example of what I'm talking about. My game Loneliness is a tiny abstract game that explores a single emotion through the barest possible mechanics. You move around, you approach groups of dots interacting in different ways. You approach them and they flee. Right, the gameplay, I'll be the first to admit, is far from riveting. And I don't, the story the game tells isn't really worth recounting to anyone, as you've just seen. So my question is, why does this game work for some people? And for some people, there is, of course, a key qualifier. The game doesn't work for everyone. Some people hate this game. But still, I've gotten many notes from people who cared enough to tell me that they found the game expressive and meaningful. So my question is, how? Why? Well, I would posit that loneliness works, if it works at all, as a kind of poetry. And that any expressive power it has is dependent not on compelling gameplay or on good storytelling, but rather on simple age-old poetic devices. Things like symbolism, personification, alliteration, rhyme. So one approach we might take when starting to think about a poetics of the lyric for video games is simply start by asking how these kinds of classic poetic devices might transfer to games. And I think the answer has to do with the point of these devices in poetry, which is to create rhythm, to draw attention, prompt reflection, and generally to layer and heighten meaning. And I could give many more examples from my own games or from other small abstract games, but in the couple of minutes I have left, I'd like to show how this approach can also be usefully applied perhaps to larger, more traditional games. So here we have one of my favorite moments from Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, coming across one of the benches that's scattered across the game world, which you can kind of see down there on the lower left. Right, and just deciding that I want to just take a moment, sit down with my brother, and look out at the landscape. Why does this moment work? Certainly there's important narrative context to this moment, and we could also look at the bench sitting mechanic in terms of fun, balanced gameplay. But I think it's perhaps more productive to see this moment as a kind of line break. It disrupts the rhythm of the game, it creates space, a moment to pause and reflect, a moment to appreciate what's going on and realize that someone's crafting this, pay attention. In other words, the bench functions as a kind of interactive poetic device. Or we can consider a moment from an older game. Has anyone played Super Metroid? Yes, yes. I vividly remember coming to this save portal after many save portals, all of which function the same way. And this one simply doesn't work. Does anyone else remember this? And I remember thinking, what the hell, the game's broken. But then gradually coming to realize that the reason it doesn't work is that I'm in a wrecked ship and the power's cut off. And this certainly isn't a radical idea today, but at the time this was kind of mind-blowing to have the game, the diegetic world of the game and the non-diegetic world of the UI come together like this. It was one of the most memorable moments for me in the game, and again I have to ask, why does it work? Well, one way that it works is on the level of poetics. We can think of the save portals as rhyming throughout the game, right? And then you come to this moment and the rhyme breaks. It's startling, jarring, and again draws attention to the craft that's at work. It forces you to reconsider how you think about this game and maybe how you think about gameplay in general. And unfortunately, I don't believe I have time for more examples, but my hope is to leave you with this image. My hope is to leave you curious about the possibility space that might open up if we can expand the frameworks we use to think about meaning in games. And thank you very much. I think maybe we have time for a question or two. Susana, do we, or no?
Actually, you have a little bit of time, because you wrapped it up rather efficiently.
Okay, okay. I wanted to, okay.
Any questions for
Yes.
It seems like there's a lot of I'm like more audio sound focused, and it seems like there's a lot of parallels between the way that the visual nature of video games kind of abstract information and allows people to kind of decouple it into patterns, and then when that pattern breaks, that's like a poetic moment, as you mentioned. And so I'm kind of curious as to if you've had make you give another example, if you've experienced this in the form of an audio or a musical example of this happening.
An audio or musical example. That's a really fantastic question, especially because I do tend to think quite a lot about audio in my games. the short answer is that I'm probably going to have to think about that, because otherwise I'm going to spend the minute that I have left here considering that. But that's a really good. I think there's definitely space and definitely moments for that to happen. I just have to think a bit more about coming up with some good examples. So yeah, thanks for pointing out the audio aspect, because I think that's crucial for video games. Anything else? Yeah.
You're quite humble about your games, but I've played many of them, and I can say that they're actually very beautiful. And one of the things that I think is important about poetry, which maybe you can speak to a little bit, is the concentration of a great deal, usually into very few words. And I think that that's part of the craft that's so important. And I feel that that's similar in some of your own work too. Distill a great deal down to these very, very simple but concentrated parts. So could you mention?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely. I think I think thinking about lyric poetry as being kind of a compact form, like you said, where there's sort of a lot of layers, kind of very compacted strongly together. I think a lot of that, to me, a lot of that has to do with these strategies that poetry uses to kind of layer meaning. And look at like like all these this whole kind of range between sort of like literal meaning and completely symbolic meaning, and that poetry oftentimes you're kind of working with layers in that space, and so I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is using working with imagery a lot. Obviously is a big part of poetry, which to me connects very strongly. I mean, looking at someone like Focht and the idea of phantasms, right? That there's something about poetry that's somewhat, when you compact meaning that tightly, you lose a certain element of control, because you're sort of relying on phantasms to a certain extent, right? You're relying on these threads of meaning that might become apparent to the user based on what, right? The whole history of someone's experience and culture and society with language, all these things. And you can't have complete control over that, but I think that's a lot of where that kind of compact meaning comes from, is kind of tapping into, putting out little symbols, little images that tap into sort of, all kinds of concepts and ideas that can be very resonant for people. Yeah, is that? Great, thank you very much.
Strikes me that we just came up with something that gets at the difference between poetry and academic language. The opposite. Our next speaker is Kara Stone. Kara is a current student in the Film and Digital Media PhD program. Kara draws from a number of very rich traditions, particularly queer, feminist, and disability theory, to investigate an artful art-making practice. The work she'll share with us today poses the possibility of, quote, forming a reparative art practice, one that is inclusive of the paranoia, the critical, the difficult, and the bad feelings that are a part of queer and disability life. Please welcome Kara.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susana. So my work, I come at video games as an art, so I'm so glad to have the presentation from Jordan that came at it the same way. And for me, I'm really concerned in mental disability or mental illness. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is about feelings. And so that's emotion not just as a psychic property, but also a somatic affective force in our bodies that circulates between us and objects, including art objects in video games. So I'll be talking about a critical practice or research creation method that I am thinking about that combines those interests, and I'm calling it reparative game design. And before I get into that, let me talk about what I mean by reparative. So I'm going to talk a bit about theory right here. In her book, Touching Feeling, queer theorist Eve Sedgwick proposes two forms of analysis in academia. That's paranoid reading and reparative reading. And her use of the word paranoid and schizoid, often medicalized and pathologized terms, is not lost on me in this talk about mental illness. It is emblematic of a larger culture of using disability as a metaphor. But going on from that, paranoid reading is the most common form of reading within academia. It consists of familiar protocols like maintaining critical distance, outsmarting each other, and one-upmanship. Reparative reading, on the other hand, is a less suspicious mode of critique that focuses on healing queer wounds rather than simply pointing out more insidious forms of oppression. It is described as multiplicity, surprise, rich divergence, consolation, creativity, and love. Reparative reading is a form of academic creation where the emphasis is on finding forms of healing and reparation rather than the seemingly endless approach of finding more and more to be depressed about. Queer theorist Lee Edelman criticizes this and argues that Sedgwick repeats the schizoid practice it claims to depart from. Distinguishing paranoia from reparation enacts a hypocritical circularity. Edelman is not arguing that there's no healing that can take place within reparative reading, but that amelioration will always inflict some harm. And Heather Love makes the case that the essay itself is not only reparative, but it is paranoid too. She says, practicing reparative reading means leaving the door open to paranoid reading. There is risk in love, including the risk of antagonism, aggression, irritation, contempt, anger. Love means trying to destroy the object as well as trying to repair it. Not only are those two positions, the schizoid and the depressive, inseparable, not only is oscillation between them inevitable, but they are also bound together by the glue of shared affect. So here, importantly for me, the good and the bad are not divisible from one another. Anne Cvekovic, another queer affect theorist who writes on depression in particular, is careful not to suggest that mental illness and bad affects should be transformed into positivity. Bad experiences and negative feelings are not forced to transform into a positive or something to be celebrated, but are instead framed as political statements and political resources. So furthermore, the bad and the good are wrapped up into one. Cvekovic says, we are not to presume that they are separate from one another or that happiness or pleasure constitutes the absence or elimination of negative feeling. So for me, a way to fully utilize the reparative is to embrace the possibility of hard and difficult and unwanted feelings. Criticism, paranoia, and refusal are all part of self-defense and protection and ultimately healing. So fundamentally, to have something be reparative, there cannot be a dismissal of the negative or even an orientation towards being better or being healed, as if that's like a real end state that anyone can achieve. It's an ongoing process. So reparation can actually be to look deeper into that negative and to embrace it, as difficult as it may be. And I see art and video games as a way to stay in that and be able to play within those difficult feelings. So what I'm thinking of as reparative game design is somewhere that references art therapy and as well as research creation within the academic institution. And we often hear that making art can be therapeutic, and that playing games can be therapeutic. And I don't like to use the word therapeutic because there are a lot of meanings with it, and often it's really synonymous with soothing or feeling better or feeling good, not bad. And also maybe prevents people from actually seeking out therapy. So in the realm of art therapy, it's very psychoanalytic, and it's wrapped up in the subconscious and the symbolic, and also within a mind frame of you make art and then you feel better, which I think from hearing what I just said is not what I'm interested in doing. I think that making art can definitely be a way to feel release, a common way of thinking about art therapy. But it can also be a way to realize, to come into an understanding of yourself or an understanding of the world and others around you. It's a process of working through those difficult feelings and actually staying inside those feelings as long as they need to be felt, and maybe even bringing out those difficult feelings, and maybe even feeling even worse. So my video games that I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about psychosocial disability are never made to find the good in mental illness or never to look on the bright side. And it's not to treat or to cure either. Instead, it is to explore those feelings we think are wrong and are told are bad and use them to realize ourselves and realize the vast possibilities of the world. going back to Anne Svekovich, she states, "It might instead be important to let depression linger, to explore the feeling of remaining or resting in sadness without insisting that it be transformed or reconceived. But through an engagement with depression, this book," her book, Depression, A Public Feeling, "also finds a way to forms of hope, creativity, and even spirituality that are intimately connected with experiences of despair, hopelessness, and being stuck." She sees depression as being stuck, as an impasse or a blockage. And if that's the case, she sees creativity as a way of moving through it, and creativity as flexibility. And that sometimes moves forward, sometimes it moves sideways, and sometimes it moves backward. So I deeply believe that creating art can be a healing experience, something that sustains us and gives us life rather than draining it. But what are the structures that ensure that, and what kind of art do we make? So why games? Something I ask myself quite often. So I feel very precarious talking about reparative game design because of popular conversations around empathy games and around games for change. And I won't go into detail about that here, but some things to note about how I'm thinking about games are I don't want games to cure disability. I don't want to fix people or create games that are oriented towards making people feel better. That being said, I do want to create games that give people a wide range of emotional responses, including peace or melancholy or joy or love or despair. I think all of it is in a healthy, wide range. It's all good. I don't think that games are more persuasive than any other art media. I think all media, including academic texts, are really capable, of intense emotional experiences. And then interactivity does not lead to a more powerful emotional reaction, which with my time, maybe I will not get into here. So I believe that play is very closely aligned with reparative reading. Sedgwick associates the realm of experimentation, of uncertainty, and pleasure with reparative reading. And I see play as a way of making these difficult feelings bearable, not better, but bearable. Play as a mechanism to stay in the trouble. Okay, so some games that I've made. This is my first video game I ever made about 5 years ago. It's called Medication Meditation, and it was to bring focus to the mundanity of the effort involved in maintaining mental health well-being. There were times that I felt exhausted or trapped by practices that I have to incorporate into my daily life, and it came into this. And I was very inspired by Laurent Berlant's book, Cruel Optimism, and a chapter entitled Slow Death, which theorizes the physical wearing out of a population. It conceptualizes the gradual wearing out of people, specifically the debilitated, where life maintenance becomes a primary focus, the daily, ordinary work of living on. So in this game, you do breathing exercises, you go see a therapist, you have to take your medication at the right time, and it's not a linear game, like one level does not unlock another level and then unlock another level. These are little exercises that you move in between. Another is Cyclothymia, which is a narrative game that's connecting astrological ties to emotional cycles and rethinking the medicalization of mental illness. And then I have an upcoming game that I'm working on here called Ritual of the Moon. And Ritual of the Moon is a durational multi-narrative video game about loneliness, healing, and destruction. It follows a witch who has been exiled to the moon during a Neo-Salem witch trial, and she discovers that she has the powers to destroy or heal the earth. Each day, a little bit of the witch's narrative is unfolded, discovering more about her life and her lover Melinda and how she ended up on the moon. And this story takes up imagining a future as well as the past, tying it together in a cyclical rhythm. The visuals are created from handmade objects that we scanned and digitized and then manipulated, reflecting that story blend of past and future and mystical and technological. And all the text in the game was hand embroidered by me and wood burned by me, which worked as a nice meditative proofreading of the game. And the history of technology is interwoven with that of women's work and traditional crafts. And so me and the artists aim to sew together a dichotomous ideas of the handmade and the digital, and the past and the future, and magic and science fiction. And SpokeIt, who I've mentioned already, discusses crafting as an especially healing artistic practice because its qualities of bringing the maker into the body. But I'm thinking about creating digital art. And so I'm thinking about the crossovers there. And the more that we made material objects and scanned them and then digitally manipulated them, the more we thought about the importance of the materiality within the digital and the vast growing concern of e-waste. So trying to be really present in that. And thinking about what Donna Haraway calls the Capitolocene, the relationship between capitalism and the Anthropocene, where the earth becomes viewed as a resource, one that we are running out of. So I think any reparative art practice needs to be mindful of not repairing oneself at the expense of others, including the earth. And within the game, you track your choices that you make, which are supposed to be reflective in the mood that you were feeling that day, and you can look back on it over time, which comes from my own practice of journaling and like rating my days 1 star out of 5 or like 3 stars out of 5. So you can look back at the time period and not feel so sucked into the feeling itself and maybe have a little room. Really quickly, my next upcoming game is a visual novel, which is really inspired by my time at UCSC, surrounded by nature, as well as post-human and ecosexual scholars. And it's about the interconnected affinities of queerness and disability and environmental justice. Again, the irony of playing a game set in nature, but not being in nature becomes a focus part of it. And I approached it as if, like, what if this woman could talk to the moon? Or what if the moon had a sexuality? What would it be like? Or what does dirt want out of humans? So in sum, I don't think we have to think of art as an expression or a demonstration of a fully worked out idea, but an exploration of a feeling or something mysterious, of something we can't put our fingers on yet. In this exploration, we learn to witness ourselves and the way we feel, the way we process, and how we come to our thinking. To make reparative art, it doesn't have to be an autobiography. None of my games are specifically about me, but they do source emotional experiences that I've had. And I think that it's really, if you are genuine and put honest feelings into your artwork, the audience can respond to that much more. So I aim to create a reparative game design process and its product that tends to the human as an interspecies assemblage, firmly rooted in complex intersectional political systems that strives for healing of the maker as well as players through staying in the trouble and using play as a tactic to make that trouble bearable. Thank you.
I don't know how much we want to be on time.
Mine's a little short anyway. Okay.
How about one question? Would anybody like to? Does anyone have a question for Carlo?
I'm curious about what you think about, there seems to be like a weird obsession with the video game industries. Video games need to like end, like have a terminal point at which you leave the experience and return to the real world. And I'm curious about what you think, or like kind of when you think a reparative game needs to do that, or if it ever even needs to do that, or if it becomes just a thing that you return to over and over again, and like kind of when it kind of, if it's supposed to eject you or like lead you slowly back to outside of the work.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think there needs to be a multiplicity of projects that do it in different ways. For Ritual of the Moon, I was thinking a lot about what you're talking about, because who has time to play 80-hour video games? Or if we think about healing practices that a lot of people do, you have to do it every day. So Ritual of the Moon, you play over 28 days for 5 minutes each day. And there is an endpoint of 28 days, but that's quite long still. So I was thinking about games that you revisit every day and you incorporate into your life in a more shorter time period that we can actually access. Like Mystic Messenger. Like I love Mystic Messenger or Animal Crossing. Those games don't necessarily have an endpoint. They become incorporated into the day. Not to say that we should be playing any one game forever, including games that are like supposed to get you to reflect onto your mood, but as long as you feel they're useful. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome our next speaker, Cyril Focht,
Yes.
who I'm meeting for the first time today. Cyril, excuse me, is a student in the Computational Media MS program. His talk today will walk us through his current work thinking through the concept of interactive paradox, right? In investigating where within games paradox exists, Cyril's work helps us to see how it may be better understood and used in the design process. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for Melanie and everyone who helped put this together. Think back to the last time you used a flash drive, because it probably looked something like this. You try to insert it into the computer, and it doesn't go in. So you flip it over and try again, and it still doesn't go in. So you flip it over again, and this time it goes in. That doesn't make sense. I'm Cyril Focht. Today I'm going to be doing an exploration of interactive paradox. What does that mean, and what does it look like? Before we dig into examples, I want to discuss some definitions, starting with Willard Van Orman Quine, 20th century philosopher and logician who in 1966 proposed 3 classifications of paradox: veridical, falsidical, and antinomy. Veridical, in short, is a statement whose conclusion seems absurd, yet turns out to be true. Take an individual born on February 29th, who by the time they turn 20 will have only had 5 birthdays. Falsidical, on the other hand, is a statement whose conclusion seems absurd because it's grounded in fallacious reasoning. A classic example is the misproof to show that 1 is equal to 2, which depends on a division by 0. And lastly, antinomy is a statement containing an internal contradiction, such as the liar's paradox. This statement is false. And these definitions work really well for logical paradox, but don't really apply to other forms, such as perceptual paradoxes like impossible figures or shepherd tones, which are a series of tones that sound like they ascend or descend continuously. And there are definitions available for all of these other forms, but most of them are similarly narrow in what they describe, and we need something that's a little bit more broad. In her 2014 book, Paradox, Margaret Coanzo presents a fairly thorough discussion of the nature of paradox. To summarize her first chapter, something is paradoxical when it follows internally consistent logic, yet defies intuition. And the definition of intuition that she uses is from Kahneman's 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a series of immediate judgments based on familiar patterns in an unfamiliar environment. And this is sufficiently broad to propose my own definition of interactive paradox, which is a paradox in which interaction is necessary for the subject to be interpreted as being paradoxical. So what does that look like? I'm going to start by using Monument Valley by Us2 Games to contrast interactive and non-interactive examples. In this level, the structure is paradoxical, but we interpret it as such before interacting with it. Compare that to this second example, where our interpretation of the structure of this level actually changes when we rotate this corner to the right side. Here again, we see paradox in the structure of the level, similar to the first example, as there are multiple objects which appear to be occupying the same space. But in this case, the paradox is revealed to us through interaction by opening different faces of this cube. Naya's Quest by Terry Kavanagh takes advantage of the limitations of representation of isometric tiles in 3 dimensions. In this level, the path across to the exit seems fairly obvious at first, but after taking a couple steps forward, we realize it actually looks more like this, which doesn't make a lot of sense until we rotate the level and see that the 3-dimensional structure has been obfuscated from us. Antechamber by Demerith has a room which contains a series of cubes, which all appear to be containing multiple different objects overlapping one another, depending on which direction we view them from. And one of them even contains a hallway. Another hallway just outside of this room has a door which is only ever open when the player is facing away from it. All of the other doors up to this point have been opened by some sort of switch nearby, so the player expects to be able to open this one the same way, not by walking through it backwards. In Gorogoa by Jason Roberts, the player is presented with a series of disjointed panels. The goal here is to get the apple in one panel to drop into the bowl in another. The problem is that none of the images in the panels seem to be showing the same physical space, until you zoom in and the images align. Other parts of this game have elements of figure-ground ambiguity. Like this image, our perception of which part of the image frames another part tends to depend on which part we're looking at. But unlike a static image, Gorogoa uses the act of dragging these panels to create an ambiguity of framing. So in this case, starting out, the sign frames the door, but once the door is dragged over, the door then frames the wall. Descent by Parallax Studios has a similar ambiguity of framing, but in this case, it's movement through space that changes the framing of directionality. In other words, it's really easy to lose track of which way is up. Now, what kinds of patterns can we see emerging from these examples? The most obvious common thread, I think, is the number of games here that have paradox of a spatial nature. Within this, we have contradictory structures, which can't really exist outside of this representational context, and some based in the limitations of representation, such as a 3-dimensional structure which gets interpreted 2-dimensionally. We also have some examples of figure-ground ambiguity. One based on the ambiguous framing of images, and another based on framing of directionality. The last category is that of seemingly absurd solutions. So here we have the door from Antechamber, the dropping apple in Gorogoa, and of course, the flipping USB problem. But at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, but Cyril, some of these examples don't really seem to be interactive. Those cubes in Antechamber only needed to be interacted with to show a paradox that's already there. And if you are saying this, I agree. So why am I still arguing that they're interactive paradox? If we look at non-interactive examples, let's take this impossible figure. The paradox doesn't actually occur in the figure itself, but rather in our observation and interpretation of it. This triangle is just a bunch of lines on the screen. The reason it's paradoxical is because we try to interpret it 3-dimensionally. Turning back to interactive examples, we still have this observation occurring, but we also have interaction happening. So in examples like the cubes in Antechamber, the paradox still occurs in our observation of it, but interaction is necessary to make this observation. Whereas in examples like the flipping USB problem, the paradox occurs in our interaction with the system. If we set the flash drive down, paradox can't occur. But we still need to be able to observe the system to interpret it paradoxically. Another way of looking at these examples, where paradox occurs in the interaction, is that the player's mental model of a system doesn't quite line up with the way the system actually works. So if the player shifts their mental model to fit the way the system works, then the paradox collapses and all is right with the world again. Because of this, I think there may be a lot of potential for this to be used in teaching reasoning about systems. Since reasoning about paradox has a way of pointing at where these failures occur in one's mental model, repeated exposure to this may be useful in training a mindset of seeking out and pinpointing these misalignments between models. Questions? might have talked a little bit too quickly.
Yeah, great. There's plenty of time.
Okay.
If we choose to.
So what's your next step?
Figuring out the sort of aesthetic implications of this. So in these examples that I was going through, there's this paradox occurring that I'm looking at, but there's also this question of how does that add to the experience of the game? So what I'm personally very interested in this is sort of a poetics of paradox. So paradox is used fairly commonly in a lot of mystic poetry and things like Taoism and Sufism, and so I'm very interested in how I can apply that sort of poetic approach within games.
Do you have any thoughts on how the actual, I'm thinking of it more in terms of like straight up like video game possibility space, but how does the nature of the input into the possibility space shape the framing of the paradoxical interaction?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
So in terms of like does the fact that a video game might have abstracted input in which you're only allowed like 6 buttons or something and a joystick, does that change the nature of the interpretation of their paradox as opposed to if it was like a touch control kind of thing, or?
I'm not sure. I think it depends on what kinds of patterns the players are expecting. So thinking of intuition as recognizing patterns. If we have something such as on a joystick and buttons that plays into well-recognized design patterns for that input, that we then change over to work on a touch screen, that very well could occur. I think in a lot of examples, it's definitely, at least in the ones I've been looking at, it's based in what the player has been set up to expect beforehand. So like the door in Antechamber, there have been plenty of doors up until that point that were all opened in a different way.
So it kind of like requires like that setup before the paradox reveals itself.
Right,
okay.
Yeah.
We're going to go above beyond. How do you feel about that, Melanie? Oh, sure. Yeah, yes, one more question. Thank you.
Okay. So have you thought about how this might relate to the breakdown as demonstrated in the ELIZA effect?
I have not considered that. I think, yeah, because the ELIZA effect has to do with the way that the user is interpreting the system. I have no idea how to answer that question, but I really like that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Batu Aytemiz, who is also a PhD student in computational media. He's going to share with us his work today on the innovation of game tutorials. Game tutorials are often not very satisfying for a variety of reasons, which directly impacts or can end up directly impacting how a player feels about the game and the relationship to the game. To help us learn some innovative approaches to designing game tutorials, please welcome Batu.
Sure, this will work. All right, welcome everyone. I'm Batu, and today I'll be talking about my project called Talin. It's a better way to make tutorials. So in the winter quarter, a few months ago, I was playing this game. It is called Dawn of War. It's a AAA title. It's a real-time strategy game, and this is a tutorial part. As you can see, I had to pan the camera to the fortress. There was one indication, there was another, there was another, there was another, there was another. I really got it. I've been playing video games for a long time, and this tutorial was bothering me. It was just cluttering, and it cut off my progress. So I was annoyed. I decided to draw some stuff, and I looked up a tutorial on how to draw an owl. This was the first step. This was the second one. I did not get this one. So I think it goes to show that not everyone requires the same type of guidance. A masterful artist might get this. I am not a masterful artist. But when it comes to this type of stuff, I've been playing games for several years, and I do not this much padding. So I started asking questions. Why does this matter? Why is it important that we give our players in game context the help they need when they need it? Because inevitably they'll get stuck. And when they get stuck, we need to help them out. As game designers, we need to embed structures to guide our players. But also, we need to be conscious about not pushing the boundaries. And sometimes it's important to back off. Microsoft Clippy does not have a good legacy, so we don't want to repeat similar things with the tutorial systems we make. So what I propose with my Talin system? Basically, I want the system to be used by people, so it comes in the form of a Unity asset. Unity 3D is the most popular and most commonly used game development tool. And the way the tool is structured allows game designers, or anyone really, to use it without any coding. And we'll get there in a minute. What it does on the highest level, it basically tracks individual player skills. So it might be tracking the skill related to jumping ability, skill related to shooting ability. So instead of having one aggregate skill level of the player, easy, medium, hard, we compartmentalize it. And we update it in real time. After tracking it, the designer basically has an authority. They can make decision when to give hints based on what the skill levels. And when the designer detects the skill level, the player needs help, they can query the skill level to give the hint they desire. And the end user, the players, will benefit from this because the experts will not be cluttered by the needless tutorials, prompts, and unskippable cutscenes, whereas the novices will get all the help they need when they need it. And also, the system really allows tutorials to be embedded throughout the game. In most cases, tutorials are front-loaded in the first and the second levels, and later on they just dissipate. But in this context, if we use the Talin tutorial, the tutorial will be embedded throughout the game. And let's say you play the first 2 levels in these days, and you take a month break, and when you come back, you're past the tutorial levels, you don't remember what to do, the Talin system will help you remember what's necessary. And finally, accessibility is a very important thing. Not everyone requires the same sort of guidance, not everyone requires the same sort of explanation to go through certain things, and not everyone has access to the certain affordances. And using the Talin tool actually helps games be more dynamic to fit all different needs. So how does it work? Basically, it operationalizes then cooks skill atom theory. On the highest level, the skill atom theory starts by having a player action. The player action can be pressing a button. There is a reaction to the player action, the simulation step. The system actually computes what happens when the action happens, and there's feedback. That can be graphical feedback, auditory feedback, or any type. A concrete example would be a player presses a button, the character jumps, and there's feedback in the forms of animation. And the result is the connection between the input and the action and the result. So on the highest level, I'm going to breeze through this because it's not necessarily important, but we have a knowledge base which contains different skills. So in this case, we can be talking about breaking wall skill. Breaking walls are usually apparent in many games. If the ball is crumbling and you have a bomb or you have a powerful attack, you can actually attack it to break it. But it's not very obvious. So the designer using the tool can actually come up with this skill and say like, okay, I want to track the mastery of my players over the breaking wall skill. But breaking walls is not important across the games. The skill of breaking a wall is only important when there's a wall to break. So when is a skill important to decrease or increase? We use detectors to check that. Simply put, detectors are ways of detecting whether a skill is active or not. For example, a proximity detector, right now shown attached to a breakable wall, activates when the player is nearby. So we can make the assumption that if the player is nearby and loitering and not actually making progress, we can say that, oh, they might not be very knowledgeable about the breaking wall mechanic in the game, and we can decrement the scalar value that is attached to the skill. One thing I forgot to mention, every skill atom is represented using a number. So if the skill atom value is 0, the designer assumes the player knows nothing about the skill. And if it's 1, the designer assumes that the player has mastery over it. In this case, if the player is nearby the wall and it's not breaking the wall, the number starts decreasing. The moment it breaks the wall, the number increases. And finally, we have a hints. These type of hints can be different in-game events that the designer defines. For example, it can be activating a particle system, activating a pop-up. And it's up to the designer to decide what to do. So now I'm actually going to show you how to change a normal level using our Talin system to a dynamic tutorial level. But it's not live because this is not my laptop, but we can watch a video of me having done it live. It was live at one point, so take my word for it. So this is the game that Unity, the company of Unity made, and it showcases a 2D platformer. And this representation shows the non-tutorialized, non-Talinified level. You walk around, you jump around, and when you come to this ledge, the pop-up immediately appears, regardless of you knowing how to do it or not. And you then drop down. So in this video, I'm going to basically show myself taking this level in the Unity editor and using the tool, making it dynamic. So to prove that nothing.
We start by duplicating our zone.
Let me stop myself talking. Okay. I'll start by copying
And the first thing
the
we
level.
want to add
Oh no, I'm still talking.
is our knowledge base.
Oh well, that's fine.
Drag knowledge base, and the knowledge base is the place where all
Yeah.
our skills live.
Okay, sweet. So I just copied the initial level and then instantiated a knowledge base. And as I said, the knowledge base keeps track of all the skill items. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a new skill. And I'm naming the skill the drop skill because that's the content that we're interested in. When I create the skill, I'm simply dragging the predefined script. If you're not familiar with Unity, it's not very important, but just to show its visual, I give the name and I initialize the corresponding value. Afterwards, now we need to switch to the detector part. We created our skill, but now we need to have an understanding of when the skill is active. As shown before, I'm going to create a proximity detector component right near the area that the drop ledge skill is essential. So when I create the proximity detector, you will see that I will have to assign a skill. And I thankfully just created one. So simply dragging and dropping the skill atom we created is more than enough. Sometimes you want the skill to decay when you're within proximity, and sometimes you want it to increase, so be exercised. We can decide that. And I'm setting the decay weight right now. So all of these are visual interfaces. And in Unity, you basically need to tell it what is to be tracked. In this case, I want the proximity detector to track the main character. So I'm just going to drag the main character and put it there. And at this point, I'm adding different skills, different hints. The first hint is basically activating a particle system. And the second hint will be about activating a tutorial prompt. And this system also allows the designer to gradually introduce hints instead of saying, oh, there's a breakable wall, come on, break it by pressing X. You can actually start by saying, well, there's a breakable wall, now particle systems are appearing. Maybe you, the player, should look into it. And if the player still doesn't get it, you can actually be more explicit. We see the skill value I initialized. When I get near, the value is decreasing. When it passes the threshold we just defined, it's the particle system activates. And several seconds later, when the second threshold is passed, the tooltip also activates. All right. To conclude, I talked about the Talin system, and I wanted to show you how easy, hopefully how easy it is to use, because I want to start the conversation about making games more accessible and more dynamic. I think it's not enough to just say, tutorials need to be better, but I think it's also important to create tools that really allow designers and game developers to get to the results that we wanted. And our goal in this project is basically to release this asset in the Unity Asset Store, hopefully give it to the hands of the people, and expand the design space of what can be done with tutorials. Thank you very much. Coming to Unity Asset Store very soon. And I want to thank my collaborators on this project, Jesse, who's not here, and Isaac. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Yes, please.
Sorry, I used to be a game studies in undergrad, so I'm like eating all of this up. Like, yeah, anyway, what made you land on proximity as the main axis for when to do the tutorial, as opposed to like I guess like number of times you interact with the thing or something else?
Right. So the question was, why did I decide to use a proximity detector as my detector? Proximity detector is one of the few that we actually offer. There are input detectors that basically checks if you press a button. There is area detectors that you define a set area, similar to proximity, but more flexible. And there are focus detectors that basically increments or decrements when you're focused on a menu. So there are different ways, and the way it's structured is to allow people who are comfortable with coding to expand the detectors. So if your game requires a certain type of interaction to be detected through certain callback functions, you can accomplish that. But it's the easiest visually to explain, I feel. Okay. Yes?
So you showed an example from a platform game. Are you thinking about, but it seems like, you know, the game, you were talking about an RTS game at the beginning.
Yeah.
So is the scope of this something that you're trying to create something that would be useful across a variety of game genres, all game genres? There's obviously quite a few differences between how different kinds of games operate. Yeah, what kind of scope are you looking at for something like this?
So the question was about the scope of the project, whether it's limited to 2D platformers or something more. That's a great question. 2D platformers are easy to engage with. Ideally, the tool should be able to be used in any type of game, because proximity can work in 2D or 3D, and the hint structures are such that you're activating a game object or the designer is defining it. So it shouldn't be bound, but this was an easy, reachable scope. Hopefully, by the time it's released, the asset is released in the fall, we will have proximity detectors that work in 3D and focus things that check if an object is clicked, that kind of stuff. And the goal is to be inclusive to all types of games. If there are no other questions, thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Aytemiz, also a PhD student in computational media. Saya's work tackles an area of the game design process that is extremely significant, yet, in my opinion, often under-examined and under-resourced: playtesting. Her work explores how we may make the most out of playtesting by implementing machine learning to complement and expand more traditional human user testing methods. Please welcome Saya.
Hi. Is it this one?
That's it.
Yeah? Okay. Is it different?
All right. So, Monster Carlo is the name of a tool that I've been working on for my master's thesis. And let's see. It is for playtesting Unity games. And thank you, Batu, for introduction of what Unity is. And I've been working on this together with my advisor, Professor Adam Smith. He's right there, so no pressure. All right, so playtesting. Everybody probably knows, but playtesting is important. This is how you find out if your game crashes, if certain conditions can be met or avoided. You can also find out whether your game is fun, but for that you need human playtesters. Right? Companies pay a lot of money, set up these testing things, or else you can like ask your friends and beg your friends to play test your game. The problem here is that it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of time, so a very slow turnaround. If you want to try many versions of your game, it will be problematic. So the solution is machine play testing. Right, so the machines can play a lot faster than humans. They don't get bored. They can do exhaustive search in some ways. They can provide play traces instead of people having to take notes on paper. Unfortunately, those cute little guys don't know how to play your game. So, a little bit about Monte Carlo tree search. So it started with the one-armed bandit, right? So say you had a bunch of them and you're trying to figure out which one of them is going to give you the most return on your hard-earned cash. So you will start by playing the first one 10 times and playing the second one 10 times and so on, and then see, okay, well, these 3 gave me the best return, so I'm going to play these 3 10 times each and see which one's better. And then turns out they don't give you anything, so then you're like, maybe I should return to the first ones. So Monte Carlo tree search works kind of like that, where it goes, this is a tic-tac-toe slide. So the first, you have, right, 9 options for your first move. So you will be like, okay, I'm going to try each move. And then you know that you want to make that first move, but you don't really care about what happens next. You're just trying to assess how good that first move is. So you play several games just randomly, only caring about the first move at first. And then you start expanding your tree by exploring the moves that gave you the best return with random play. So every time you play, you return back whether or not you won. And that's how you can assess whether or not it's a good move. So next we're going to talk about restricted play a little bit, because while you can learn a lot about a game by just playing it a lot randomly, there are many questions that you can ask when you use the concept of restricted play. For example, about balancing. Say you're creating a card game and you want to introduce a new card, like in Magic, right? New cards. And you want to know if this card is going to play the game or break the game, or if it's going to be completely useless. So you create player models and say, okay, every time you have that card, play it. Then you take another one and you're like, whenever you see that card, pretend you don't have it at all. And you put those against each other and see how well they do. And that should tell you, if one player consistently beats the other guy, then your card is probably overpowered. So there have been a lot of wonderful scientists who have worked on this concept. And there's a Professor Adam Smith works on Ludicore, which was a logical game engine that helped you model games. It would collect play traces, and you could be like, okay, how far can you get if you only have 10 moves? And those kinds of things. So you could specify constraints and see what kind of play traces you would get with those. So the problems with all those researchers, and of course I couldn't have gotten where I am without their work, is that games would have to be created specifically for the systems that they used. And like Batu, I'm trying to target game makers in the real world, so I'm going for the Unity game engine. A lot of wonderful games have been made. You may have heard about a few of them. So let's talk about Monster Carlo. So in green, and I apologize for any colorblind people. In green, we have your game and some experiments that you would like to be able to run. And then in yellow comes in my tool. It consists of a Python module, which has within it Monte Carlo tree search implementation and a C# support library that goes into your game executable. So to begin with, your experiment settings is passed on to the Python model, communicated through the C# module to the game. We are also passing the action prefix, which at the beginning is 0. An action prefix is what the tree already knows are good moves, or what it wants to explore more. So once this started, the game is starting. Every time it needs to make some kind of decision in game, it will ask the C# module Now, the beauty of Monte Carlo is that it is very agnostic to game rules. So all the C# module needs to know is how many options it has. So the game will be like, I can do 5 possible things. Which one should I do? And the C# module will be like, number 3. And that's how the game is played. So after the game has finished running, it will tell its final score to the C# module, which will update the Monte Carlo tree with that play trace and the score. And the tree will then make its next decision on which moves to explore next and send the action prefix back into the game. Then once usually you say like, okay, play the game 10,000 times, see what happens, right? So once all of the experiments are complete, the results are passed back to you, and you can store them and you can visualize them from there. I'm not going to go into this very much, but these are functions that are in the C# library that you use. So as you see, at the very least, is that there are not many. And this is your interface with your game, so you wouldn't have to change your game very much to be able to use that tool. Now let's talk a little bit about It's Alive. As you see, there's monsters there, and this is where the project got its name, Monster Carlo. It's Alive is a game I made. It's kind of Tetris-y, kind of plumbery. You build monsters. Now, Monte Carlo tree search only works if every time you make a sequence of moves, you get to the same position, the same state in the game. So in It's Alive, we have a random element because pieces fall at random. So we just fixed the random seed. So every time it would be the same sequence every time you play. Otherwise, Monster Carlo wouldn't work. So we did some experiments. Now, as far as the decisions go for the C# module to make, right, you can move left or right, you can rotate a piece, but you as a player can rotate a piece as many times as you want, and it doesn't really change the game state. So instead, we look at the actions as landing it, in one of the 5 columns and in what orientation, or else you can collect the monsters. So we reinvented the actions a little bit beyond just user input. And these are some experiments we were able to run. I can't see from here. All right. So my game has 3 different modes. One is monochrome, one is tenacious, and then you have the regular one. So I wanted to see if my tool would play it with those 3 different modes, what the medium scores would be. And you can see that the monochrome one, which is the monsters only come to life if they're completely the same color, is the hardest one. So that's the kind of data you can get. Then another thing we experimented with, this is the diagram on the right, is normally the tree is traversed one at a time. You get the result, you make the next decision, but we try to parallelize this. So we would have 24 games running at the same time. And each time one game is over, it would return the result, and the tree has to make a decision before it knows how the other 23 did. So you can see that the one with parallel workers initially had worse scores, but later it got better than the one with 1 worker. And my suspicion is that because it destabilized the search a little bit, with the workers coming in at different times, and because of that, the tree was able to cover broader ground and learned better moves. All right, then we also experimented with different player models. For example, say if the player collects a monster as soon as it's alive, versus the player that waits until the screen is almost full and they're going to lose the game unless they collect the monster. And then the last player was allowed to do whatever they wanted. So we can see that the greedy player scored the worst because small monsters gave you fewer points. And then the lazy one did better than the unrestricted one. And you would think the unrestricted player could have implemented the lazy strategy, but didn't. And this is a limitation of Monte Carlo tree search, because in the end, it's not an exhaustive search on big spaces. So sometimes it's going to be subhuman performance, and you have to keep this in mind. But you can still get a lot of useful data out of this, and very cheaply, because you just run it, Don't have to buy pizza for your playtesters. So next, 2D roguelike is a tutorial game for Unity. We also integrated it with our tool because I wanted to prove that it wasn't just for the game that I wrote myself and hey, look how it integrated beautifully. So I tried to take a game that I didn't write. The game is open source, so you can find the code for it. And I tried to run a couple of experiments. So in this game, you collect the food, you avoid the monsters, you try to make it to the exit, and you're running out of food every time a monster attacks you and every time you take a step. So I tried two strategies. The first player would play at random, unrestricted, and the other one would only move towards the exit. So once again, you would think that the one that only moves towards the exit will get eaten by a zombie. But with the random seed that we happen to be using, got lucky, got really high scores, whereas a random moving player didn't do so well. And this is, again, a demonstration of where Monte Carlo didn't do so well. But we learned a powerful heuristic here that we could encourage our player, and the tool does have built-in capability for that, to move more frequently towards the exit. So he would still walk around the zombie occasionally, but it would make better progress. And the other one I tried is making the monsters do twice as much damage, but also the food would give you twice as much health. And we can see that the high stakes variant still led to better results. So that's the kind of questions you can ask about your game, right? You're like, what if I do this? What happens? And that's the answer. So then, once your results are done, you can use Jupyter Notebook to visualize your data. So there is some sample code, and all of this is available on GitHub for free. I have sample Jupyter notebooks that you can use. Just plug in the names of your programs and data, and you'll be able to visualize your result and draw conclusions. All right, links. So you can play It's Alive for free on Congregate or upstairs. It is currently there. Just look for a girl in a lab coat with goggles. It might be me, but it might be one of the other students who worked on it. The paper is available online, and the GitHub code is available online. That is all.
Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker.
All right, thank you.
Our last speaker is
Present to review. Okay. Thank you. And then I bring that over here. That's what I have over here. Okay, cool. I think that worked.
our next and last speaker is Duval, also in the PhD program, right, in computational media. Great. Jared will share with us today's a game he is co-designing and developing with a team of medical professionals, speech-language pathologists, developmental psychologists, game designers, artists, and players. His innovative mobile game helps people with speech articulating challenges. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. As you said, I'm a second-year PhD student in the computational media program, working with Sri Kurniwan and Catherine Sbister. And today I'm going to look a little bit at SpokeIt, my little speech therapy game. So first, before we get into the game, we have to talk a little bit about speech impairments in children. 1 in 12, oh God, this is really hard to see. 1 in 12 US children ages 3 to 17 have a voice, speech, language, or swallowing problem. 34% of those children ages 3 to 10 have multiple conditions, and 25.4% of those children ages 11 to 17 have multiple communication disorders. So what implications does this have? Well, unfortunately, they're not great. Having a speech impairment correlates to high risk of behavioral problems, increased symptoms of depression, deficits in social and academic competencies, risks of being teased in social settings, delay in scholarship, lower income, later marriage, independence from their parents come significantly later. Some good news is 55.2% of the children who need intervention services receive them. But it makes you wonder, what about all of the other children? White children are more likely to receive an intervention than black children or Hispanic children. Boys are more likely than girls to receive the intervention. And up to 70% of speech-language pathologists have a waiting list, indicating a shortage in the workforce and difficulty accessing the therapy that they need. So what we need to do is give all children access to the resources they need to improve their speech. And I'm in no way saying that SpokeIt could ever replace any of these professionals. It's to supplement the out-of-office time that they're losing their progress. So the point I want here to make is speech is a skill. And just like any other skill, you can work on it, you can practice it, and you can set your own goals, and you can work to what you want to do. So I'm not saying speech is a normative practice, but you can achieve your own goals if you keep working at it. So traditionally, children would practice with a speech pathologist in the office. They would go home and practice 10 minutes per day is what's recommended. And parents or caretakers are the one that are facilitating this practice, who might be unqualified to assess the small nuances in leading a speech curriculum. So we interviewed a bunch of speech-language pathologists, and they suspect that little to no time outside of the office is spent doing that 10 minutes of practice. So we wanted to kind of fill that gap in that role. So I'm going to argue that a mobile serious game for health is one of the ways we can support at-home speech therapy practice in between sessions with the speech therapist. And before I do that, I'm going to define what a serious game for health is. And to do that, I might have to make a few people uncomfortable, but I'm going to define what a game is. A game is a structured form of play distinct from work, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck, usually undertaken for enjoyment. And we've seen a lot of those at the Sammys today, and if you look closely, you might even see a few serious games. A serious game is a structured form of play distinct from work, played according to rules and decided by skill, strength, or luck. It is designed and targeted at a specific population for a primary purpose other than entertainment. And we're going to take this definition one step further and define what a serious game for health is. A serious game for health is a structured form of play distinct from work, played according to rules led by a skill. It is designed and targeted at a specific population for a primary purpose to help that population achieve their goals in a medical or well-being context through enjoyable mechanics to teach a skill. So I really want to highlight this part right here, the enjoyable mechanics part, because this is what can make or break a serious game for health. We want the mechanics in the game to both be fun for that game. We want them to keep playing and practicing, because if they're not playing the game, then they're not working on those skills. And we want the skills that the game is teaching to actually translate to the real world. So when I say enjoyable, I also don't mean fun for everyone. I mean fun for the specific population that the game is designed for. Therapy can be tedious, repetitive, and unrewarding because results happen slowly. A serious game can add meaning to these repetitive tasks because it can help people celebrate the small victories. It can help keep them motivated. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on designing the speech therapy mechanic SpokeIt uses. So let's start with the technology, the speech recognition system. And so in working with all the stakeholders we have on this project, we gathered three main requirements for it to be therapeutic, medical, all those things. And those are, it needs to be offline, it needs to be mobile, and it needs to be critical. And let me talk a little bit about that. It needs to be offline because many of our players come from lower socioeconomic statuses and they just don't have regular access to the internet. So that automatically rules out a lot of speech recognition services readily available, like Alexa, Siri, Google Assistant, Cortana. And also all of those services have usage caps and lags, which would hinder real-time gameplay. We need the thing to be mobile because mobile technology is pervasive. It's much more affordable than our current healthcare. We need something that runs locally on the device. So performance of our speech recognition is a big concern because we're running it at the same time as a game. We need it to teach the right skills. So the speech recognition doesn't need to just listen for speech. It needs to listen for speech both both incorrectly and correctly. So it's trying to distinguish between proper and improper speech. So that way it can give feedback to the player and help them work on their skill. So there's a few possible technologies and frameworks we could have used, but I'm going to jump right in and explain why we chose Carnegie Mellon's Rapid Ears. So Rapid Ears is one of those things that just checked all the boxes. It's offline, it's real time, it's critical. Well, we made it critical, and it's mobile. So let's walk through how it works through an example. So if you see these two examples of sentences, there's one that is move the rock, and that would be the one that's considered most appropriate. And then there's move the rock. And you could think of many more ways to say that incorrectly, and we've come up with lots of other ways to say that incorrectly, but for this example, let's just focus on these two. Every word you say in English can be mapped to an arpabet representation. So if you look here, they're almost the same, except we got the K on the end of this one, and we don't have the K at the end of this one, and instead of moo and move. So we can represent those different ways of pronouncing speech, and we just teach it to the system as two equally statistical valid ways of saying it. So it learns them both as words. So we can teach it any word we want or any combination of words, and it just maps to them. And it does this using an acoustic model. And basically the acoustic model just takes the speech as you say it. The computer looks at it as a visual picture almost, and it maps what's most likely that you said. So these are almost identical. The only thing I'm going to point out here is you can see it's a little wider right there, and here there's almost nothing right there. So that's how it maps the sound. So we conducted some studies and found that our speech recognition engine works, and it can properly distinguish between correct and incorrect speech. And that's only a tiny part of the battle. The other part is actually making the game, and making the game fun. So what kind of game affords speaking? How do you make it fun? And what happens when you say a word incorrectly? How do you make this work? And so we started with examples that we think already do a good job at this. So think Dora the Explorer. So our first game was a storybook style game where you would touch different things in the environment, and you would get a prompt, and you would just say what the prompt was telling you as you said them. They would turn green, and once they were all green, you would move on in the story. And if the speech recognition was listening, it would be a green ear. If not, it would be a red crossed out ear. So rather simple. It was the game content was actually very enjoyable. Our users liked it. The problem was creating all this custom narrative content for each target word that we wanted to say. So if the player had already heard the story word, they wouldn't want to play the game again. And for a therapy game, you need to continually practice. And because it was in the story structure, there wasn't a lot of time to where they're actually speaking. So we wanted to get them speaking more. So we move on to our second prototype. And this is Sam and Sam. And in this one, it's more of an arcade minigame style. So there's not any narrative content. You would just click a thing, say the thing, a thing happens, and then you would just keep working on different speech. This yielded much higher rates of speech. You could put in any word targets that you wanted, but contrary to what we thought, it was not very replayable. Players were just getting bored very quickly. They didn't have any context on why they wanted to keep playing, so we had to rethink again what we wanted to do. So where we're at now is a hybrid prototype where minigames are woven into an overarching narrative, and they are designed to afford a diverse range of targets and high rates of speech output. So we took what we learned from those other two prototypes and have continually mixed them together and created a whole bunch of minigames that fit into this bigger context. So there's a new set of characters who do not speak, which flips the perspective from the game helping the player to the player helping the game characters. So it's kind of flipping. It's not they don't feel like they're being worked on. They feel like they're helping somebody else. There's a magical star powered by speech who narrates the game named Nova. We removed all touch interactions except for the ones where they would offer support. So you would touch a target and it would tell you how to say it to help you out. All of our targets, all of our words are illustrated. So players who cannot read can now see what they need to say. It gives direct feedback of speech progress through game events. So when you say something correctly, something good happens. If you say something incorrectly, it lets you try again. Something not as good happens, but not bad happens. So It's always progress, it's just not as fast progress. And it always gives you context on how you could do better. And the last part of the therapy that we really improved on is this idea of show and tell. So speech therapy is a mechanic thing. You're moving, you're doing things, and just hearing how to speak correctly can be very frustrating because that doesn't help you always. So we wanted to give it a little bit more context. So we wanted to show how to say correct things by all these little mouth animations, and hopefully that helps teach those skills. And also we made, so the characters are super animated and fun. We added all these emotions and ways they can communicate without speech. So we're gearing up for beta release. We have a lot more work to do, but we are excited to see where the project leads next, and I am happy to take any questions.
How difficult was it to reach your target audience?
Very. So we have a working relation with UC Davis, and they have the medical center, so we work with lots of children with cleft speech. And then we also work with Hope Services, which is local in Santa Cruz, and they have, it's all adults with developmental disabilities, and we recruited all of the ones who wanted to, who also had a speech impairment as a co-occurring disability.
Although this is clearly for young,
It's for children.
what's the age, would you say?
Well, according to the NSF grant, it's 4 to 12, which is huge.
Yeah, a lot of development happens in that.
So
Big task.
what we've done for that is, so I'm going to go back and some of these mini games here are, so this one I would say is geared much more for younger audiences, so it's just colors, right? And then the next step of this mini game, if you have to say the word coat, there would be a coat here, and you would have to remove the coat to get the trash to go into the bin. So it's a very simple mechanic, it's bright colors, but as you get older, you might want some more engagement and interactivity, and that's where something like Eliza comes in. So in this one, all of these gears are turning based on which one you see. Those are the 3 you have to say, and if you say them correctly, these evil storm clouds get sucked up. If you say them incorrectly, this juice keeps rising. Once the juice is all the way to the top, a new storm is made. So the interaction and the rules in each of the mini games is very different depending on what age range you're in.
How large is your team? And this is a lot of game design, apart from many other things as well, right?
Yeah, so, remember how I walked you through the 3 prototypes in the very beginning, or the 2 prototypes and then that led to SpokeIt?
Oh, yes.
So,
Yes.
these 2 were made by 1 or 2 people. And this actually turned into a dissertation by the colleague. So I took on this project right here before it got to this. And since I've taken on the project, I have recruited many undergrads that kind of come and go. So I would say on average I have about 6 undergrads, and then there's 5 grad students who are a little bit involved in it. So developmental psych department is involved in this, but doing a lot of the testing and stuff, but not so much the development. I do most of the, I say I do most of the design work, but in reality, we go to Hope Services or UC Davis, and we have all these stuffed animals that represent all our game characters, and we use this rapid prototyping thing called Adobe XD, and we have them create the games. And then, so I never would have imagined. They basically said, we want gears in the sky to control the weather. I thought I would never be able to figure out how to do that. But it turned into one of my favorite mini games because we actually went out, asked them what they wanted to play, and then we created the narrative structure around that, created this Eliza machine. And we're actually, this summer is when I'm bringing it all back to them and seeing if it's what they envisioned and what they wanted. Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Your elbows, it's fine.
Okay, well, we should start. I'm live. Hello, world. My name is Jim Whitehead. I am the chair of computational media here at UC Santa Cruz. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session of the research talks. So the first talk is by Kay Compton, a PhD student here at UC Santa Cruz, and someone who has developed a great deal of fame with things like tracery and making bots on the internet, and no doubt, her advisor, many people probably think of her advisor as like, oh, that's Kay Compton's advisor. So anyways, this is really good. So Kay will be presenting Surprise, the Joy of Generative Art. So Kay, thank you.
We'll be learning how to generate Jim's shirt later. This is my talk, Surprise, the Joy of Generative Art. I give a lot of talks on procedural content generation, so some of you may have seen parts of this talk. One of you actually took the class that I started developing a lot of these ideas in about 3 or 4 years ago, and they've really been evolving ever since. If I don't label the images, that means it's a JavaScript prototype that I made myself. I tried to label other people's work, so if it's not labeled, stuff I made. So yeah, what I'm going over in this talk, and are you going to do timing, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Proceed.
All right. There's really fun stuff at the very end of this presentation, and I don't want it to get cut off.
Okay.
There's a monster at the end of the presentation.
We don't have time for that.
Dang. There's Kesha at the end of the presentation.
We really don't have time for that.
We'd better.
Right.
So what can we generate? What tools do we have to do generation with, and resources to get started? I always like to talk a little bit about like the things that we generate and kind of how far back this idea of like generating art goes. Here are a couple of examples, especially since we had some historical stuff earlier today with James's talk. So things like John Whitney, who did, actually I forget what was used to generate his works. I think they were optical in some way. And Evelyn Lambert and Norman McLaren made these really fascinating, abstract, and very generative, kind of emergent animations in the 60s. The one on the right is actually, he took a film strip and painted down the length of the film strip and then projected that, creating sort of these emergent animations out of this process. But I really like to open with kind of some, like how far back generativity goes. So I'm really interested, I did a game called Spore, and that was procedural content generation, and many of you have probably heard of it. But then when I got to UC Santa Cruz, and with some of Jim's help, started looking at outside of games, what do we do, like how do we generate things? And that led to this whole journey of like going back in time all the way to some of the first generative music, which is from this roboticist named Al-Jazari in 1200 AD, who used programmable camshafts to drive a robotic orchestra that would float on a boat. Not a lot of people know about this, but it's actually fairly well documented. All the way to things like this drawing robot from the 1770s, who was also programmable, to things like the Jacquard loom, which is where we get the very the basis of programmable computation today. The little JPEG on the bottom right is not actually just a JPEG. It is one of the earliest forms of elaborately pixel-based art. This was written on the Jacquard loom in 20,000 punch cards. So that was actually a woven portrait of him. But a lot of these use, just like pointer, a lot of these use these programmable camshafts, which you see in the little animation there. So you can program things by having irregularly sized cams, and then when you crank them, things activate at different rates. So if you're ever sent back in time and have to make robots, that's what you're going to be using. But I really like how many crafts are generative as well. Does anybody in here do crafting of any sort? A couple of people. But things like weaving, card weaving is actually where the Jacquard loom weaving came from originally. But people are doing it currently. Pottery wheels, Hakone woodworking, which is and millefiori, which is you make bundles of things, and then you glue bundles of things together, and then you slice lengthwise, and you get these kind of emergent geometric patterns that repeat many times. Millefiori translates in Italian to 1,000 flowers. I don't know what the Hakone is, but I like that they're actually a very similar process for two wildly different materials. And then of course generative art actually happens all the time in modern modern existence. So there's parametric architecture. There's a company called Nervous System, which does the dresses on the top right. The center image is actually so they have wonderful design tools that you can use to design parametric jewelry and dresses. And then they have some of their own tools, or in addition to that, which then procedurally crumple up the dress so that it can be printed in a very small space. And then when you're done printing it, you can pick up the dress and the sort of whole dress falls out. And then just sort of entertainment and art pieces, like the one at the bottom left is Treachery of Sanctuary. And I just love generative art. I know I don't have exactly an objective bubble, but there's a lot of people that I hang out with who also really love generative art. And I kind of like just thinking of the different ways that we like it. So it surprises us, it kind of comes to life. It doesn't have our preconceptions, so often it'll say things that we didn't expect. It makes more art than we ever can, so faster. It's never bored. It can make art using input that we can't make art with, so things happening in real time. So I can have somebody dancing in front of a webcam, and I can never draw that fast, but my computer possibly could. And I kind of like that it lets us think about what a non-human artist looks like. This is always a fiction. It's just an algorithm, like regardless of whether we made it out of CAMS or CAD or JavaScript. But we can kind of look at it as a funhouse mirror into our own artistic practice. And so I wanted to move on to tools, just because this is a super short little presentation. I wanted to kind of go over my grand theory of generativity, which is the idea that when I started thinking about procedural content generation and this stuff, I realized that there's this concept of sort of small algorithmic pieces that I'm calling generative methods that are things like Perlin noise or Voronoi patterns or particle simulations that can kind of all socket together, like little units of generativity. These are kind of all the tools that you have to work with. And so by listing out all the tools, kind of making this epic tool chest of generativity, I can tell people like, okay, here's what you have to work with. Now assemble things. There's things in this to take things apart. There's things in this to put things back together. There's things in this to extrude things, to morph things, to do all sorts of weird stuff to stuff. So Adam actually spoke a little bit about this earlier, but content selection is kind of the easiest version of this. This is you have some stuff. You have a bag of stuff, and you're picking something from the stuff. We often don't even think about this as procedural content generation, but it's one of those kind of base Legos that helps, like we can use it in other combinations. But things like, a Disney princess quiz. I'm going to take your answers to this silly quiz, and then based on those answers, or possibly I'm going to throw those answers out the window and just roll a random number generator and say, number 6, you are Belle. And so there are things like, you even have sets of dice. So this is a set of recipe dice where there's just different ingredients. And you throw these dice and you get a selection of different ingredients and you're going to make a meal out of those. There's similar storytelling dice as well. And then things like the tarot are all about, I have some sockets and I'm going to select some objects and I'm going to put them in the socket and then I'm going to tell a story about how they got socketed in. This kind of leads us into tiles. Tiles is another really common form of generative method. You have a bag of stuff and some sockets that it can fill. So if I'm in Dwarf Fortress, there are objects that can fill, I think he's actually using voxels, or like N wide, N long, N down. And each one of those little cubes can hold stuff. But something like just laying out a Catan board, you have some sockets and you're kind of flipping tiles into them. Or Betrayal at the House on the Hill, which is one of my favorite ones, that you generate a mansion as you play. This one also goes way back. This is one of the earliest forms of generativity I found. This is a Mozart's publisher published this without Mozart's intervention and wrote it under his name. Cool. And this is dice music, and you can think of a piece of music as being a number of sockets for bars of music. And then the cards that you're putting down, you could almost re-implement this as I have a deck of cards. Each card is a bar of music, and I'm going to draw those cards and put them down until I have music. This was done with dice, but kind of same idea. Grammars, I do a lot with grammars because I'm the author of Tracery. These are making things out of other things. Parametric, which is you have a bunch of sliders, and you're sliding sliders back and forth, and you can do all sorts of cool stuff with this. Ask me later, I have a talk that goes into much more depth with that, but you can do genetic algorithms. If you have parametric generators, you can do genetic algorithms. It's the one that genetic algorithms work best with. If you're trying to do genetic algorithms with any of the others, see me. So this is like a scarf generator that kind of goes forever. This is using time as an additional parameter. Geometric transformations, which is basically you have some geometry and you're doing something with it to get some new geometry. There's a whole big bucket of methods that go into here. This one works really well with body-centric stuff or gestures. So I/O brush is you sample something and then you extrude it along a gesture. The one at the bottom is a flower bullshit generator I made. I make lots of flower generators. Distributions. This is you have a bunch of stuff and you're going to scatter that stuff somewhere. This doesn't seem particularly interesting. But you can think of like, okay, I have like a generated landscape and maybe I want tall trees on the top of the hills and I want wildflowers down by the river and I actually don't want any plants in the river itself. And so that's using that sort of height map to generate stuff. That's not your only choice. Think about like Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go uses a real-world data source, which is how often are people at different locations. And it then uses that to distribute Pokemon in different ways. In addition, they have some other layers like, is there water in this area? Should this be a water Pokemon area? But you can use whatever you want. Like if you'd like to use like Native American territories that were like lost due to treaty malfeasance, like you can use that as an input. It's kind of up to you to decide what you want your distributions to be. I'll skip that slide. I'm running low on time, and I wanted to get to the good stuff. So, like, I do a lot with particles. So particles, you tend to have like some emitters and then some forces that are moving the particles around. The one on the right is a projection I did onto an umbrella. But particles often leave trails. That's a really nice thing that particles do. You can apply all sorts of fun forces to particles. So up on the right is a dance generator that I made, or you can drive particles from sort of facial geometry like the one on the left, or the bottom left is hands driving particles. Because it's, what year is it, 2018, we have to do some stuff with machine learned statistical models. So these are models where maybe as an input it takes some edges, and then as an output it draws the catified version of those edges. You can also do sort of generative stuff. This is some of Janelle Shane's work where she fed it all of the paint chip colors from Sherwin-Williams and had it generate new, both colors and paint names. Cool. And then Google actually released this thing just a couple of weeks ago that's called PoseNet. And this takes webcam images and gives you the graph of the body. So this is basically, you can now have a connect without a connect. It's a little janky, but it's getting better. So the important thing here is that like, oh, wait, I already had some stuff that I was doing with graphs in previous slides. So generativity can be a pipeline, a whole pipeline of stuff. I made this tool called Generomenos where you can like create dense pipelines of things. But I also just wanted to give you kind of a slide of resources to get started. This would be a great thing to take a snap of if you want like a list of giant resources. But I wanted to show you something that uses a whole bunch of these things all together. Oh, wait.
Maybe the 4-finger slide.
Yeah. Let's exit. How does one even copy and paste? All right, here we go. All right, this is the fun bit. All right, so here's a generative character that I made. You can see that there's actually a mock body behind here. So this is like a sort of humanoid body, but I'm generating a weird character for it, and I can generate lots of different bodies. Some of which are particles, some of which are curve extrusions. There's kind of a whole lot going on here. I'm digging this one. So we've got some Kesha going now, which is driving this mock body. And this mock body is like pulling these particles around. So there's like a lot of different, so this is like a whole stack. If I were hooking up the webcam would be driving the mock body, and that would be driving this. So I'll just, for the rest of my talk, I will just show you various bodies that it generates. I never know what it's coming up with. Oh, I really like the feathery doodads on this one. Anyway, that's my talk. Any questions?
All right, so we probably have time for maybe one question. I have to say, I'm just myself drinking it all in as well. So.
It's a bit of a fire hose. I did this in 30 minutes at GDC one year and was accused of being a fire hose. Also accused of being on both caffeine and cocaine and on neither.
All right, no way with that. Well,
All
let's
right.
thank Kate yet again. So. This one? There we go. It's like WFC, Windows function? No, okay. So this is kind of fun. So this next talk. So Isaac has been sort of, I guess, documenting and going deep into this phenomenon of wave function collapse, which has been sort of one of the newest algorithms within the procedural content generation community. It's kind of fun in that I did my level best to try and teach wave function collapse in class just 2 days ago. I think Isaac will probably do a better job of it. So anyway, I'm kind of interested in hearing your talk. So Isaac, take it away.
We'll give it a shot. Do we have it set up for separate screens?
Yeah, you can go to the birthday here.
Yeah.
Sorry. Separate display, and then you'll have to do some dragging to
Okay.
get what you want.
One.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well. I can't actually see this.
Yeah, it's a really annoying room setup.
Is this going to close it or maximize
it?
it?
It is going to close it.
Let's do that.
The little green.
Yeah, if you can hit it. That close enough? Oh. Okay. Good. Hi, I'm Isaac Karth, and I'm going to talk about a specific procedural content technique called WaveFunctionCollapse. WaveFunctionCollapse was invented in 2016 by the indie game developer Maxime Gouman. It brings constraint solving to procedural generation in a way that's really effective to get an expressive result. As you can see from the animations here, it's capable of generating many different things from very simple input images. So in this talk, I'm going to be introducing WaveFunctionCollapse, explaining what it does, why it's important, what people have used it for, and hopefully some of how it works and what our research has discovered about it. So first, let's start by explaining what exactly does WaveFunctionCollapse do. The process at its most basic level is you take a simple small image like the one on the right here, feed it into WaveFunctionCollapse, which chops it up into little bits, and it takes those small bits and rearranges them into a larger context, like this larger picture on the right. In this example, the red lines show the connections between the small bits in the small image and the same small bits rearranged in the larger image. So why is this important for procedural generation? First off, it works on small amounts of input data. Most machine learning approaches today assume that you have big data, that you've got lots and lots of examples. But if we want to procedurally generate new content, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have our artists produce 1 million examples just to feed them into our generator. It's much better if we can just make a few small examples and get results that are almost as good. Second, the things that WaveFunctionCollapse generates are both expressive and consistent, which are both important properties for procedural generation. Third, because the input that's most commonly used is visual, it gives us an easy way to specify constraints that would be really complex otherwise, which is one of the things that lets us keep the output consistent. And finally, WaveFunctionCollapse is already being used by many developers out in the wild, so we have direct evidence that it's useful, and we can study what it's being used for. Well, the examples I've shown you so far use pixel art. WaveFunctionCollapse works on all kinds of things, not just regular grids. For example, these 3D models were generated with WaveFunctionCollapse. The voxels on the right were generated by the inventor of WaveFunctionCollapse. Well, the game on the left, Proc Skater, was made for Proc Jam 2016 and uses Unity objects. In fact, one of the developers of Proc Skater made a WaveFunctionCollapse plugin for the Unity game engine. This is only one example of WaveFunctionCollapse being re-implemented. There's versions of WFC for over a dozen programming languages, and quite a bit of variation there as people implement their own versions. And of course, we don't need to stop at 3 dimensions. If we go up to 4 dimensions, we can also do animations or different kinds of relationships across graphs. For example, these experiments by Matt Ricks, that's a perfect loop on the right there that just basically falls out of the constraints we give the WaveFunctionCollapse algorithm. And like I said, it works on things that aren't the grids you'd expect, like the Asheen poetry generator you can see here by Martin O'Leary, which generates text that conforms to rhyming patterns and meter. I think these are 2 of the examples I generated. I think the one on the left is borrowing text from Virgil, and the one on the right from Alice in Wonderland. The tool is actually available on GitHub, so you can run this code yourself. WaveFunctionCollapse is also in use in commercial games, like the in-development Viking invasion game Bad North. Oscar Sahlberg, one of the developers working on Bad North, was an early adopter of WaveFunctionCollapse, and you can see how the island generation works there in that image to the side. Another game that uses WaveFunctionCollapse generate maps is the science fantasy roguelike Caves of Cud, which has incorporated WaveFunctionCollapse into many of its map generators. Not all of them, but for a number of the special maps it uses for the procedurally generated history it does. So now that you've seen some examples of what WaveFunctionCollapse can do, let's talk about how exactly it works. It uses a somewhat complex memory representation, but that lets it do a relatively straightforward process to solve the constraints. Here I'm using an interactive demo by Oscar Sahlberg to demonstrate the observation and propagation steps at the heart of the algorithm. As I click on the different tiles to choose one of the possibilities to observe at that point, the algorithm runs the propagation step to take the implications of my observation choice and spread it to the surrounding tiles. You can notice that the tiles I don't click on still change as the constraints narrow down the possibilities. Of course, when we run it, we can also do it fully automatically. But of course, before we can have it do the propagation for us, we need it to tell it what the valid constraints are. And so here's an example of the pipeline. We take the 4x4 grid of pixels on the left, we break it apart into a bunch of overlapping 2x2 patterns, and then for each of those patterns, we compare the other patterns and see how they can be placed over the top of each other, and whether they match in that overlap or if they conflict. So the full pipeline is we give it in an example image, which it divides into those patterns, which can be of any size. Usually they're like 2x2 or 3x3, but they can go much larger if you have the memory capacity. Some of these patterns, of course, match their neighbors. Others don't. We feed this into a constraint solver, which gives us our new configuration. And then we take the output of the constraint solver and render it out into a new output image. So our research has turned up stuff like connections to other texture and model synthesis approaches. For example, Maxime's very upfront about getting inspiration from discrete modeling synthesis, like Paul Merrill's model there on the left, which uses somewhat similar methods to chop up 3D objects and reconfigure them. And the constraint solving part of WaveFunctionCollapse, while not as popular as some other procedure generation methods, has been used in a number of approaches, including for puzzle and level generation, some of which from people here at UC Santa Cruz. Since WaveFunctionCollapse is a form of constraint solving, we were able to implement a version of it using answer-set programming in just 4 lines of ASP and a bunch of scaffolding Python code. One neat thing about this is that it makes it easy for us to integrate it with other kinds of constraints. For example, if we want to add a constraint to make sure our generated level has a path that's clear from the entrance to the exit, it's easy to layer on top of it with something like a general constraint solver. So in conclusion, WaveFunctionCollapse is an interesting algorithm, and I hope I've given you a look at what it's used for and a little bit about how it works. Thanks.
All right, we have time for a couple questions.
Is like the code and like the math to kind of run this like terribly complex, or is it surprisingly kind of direct?
I'll say the initial version is laid out a bit confusingly. It's less complex than you might think. So if you are interested in it, there are tutorials, or you can reference the paper I presented last year, which actually a lot of people have been referencing as kind of a guide to like break things down step by step. Yeah. The other neat thing about that paper is it has my email address, so if you have more questions, feel free to email me. I think we had another question in the back.
Yeah, I was wondering, like all the examples I've seen of WaveFunctionCollapse, I mean, the idea of starting with like a very small amount of content and then generating content seems like it's very useful, very interesting. All the examples I've seen are from what you might call extremely small amounts of content, you know, like very, very small, sort of tightly constrained initial examples that are then generated out from, like, for example, this flower one here. Have you done any research, or I'm curious about like where the bounds are in terms of that scale of what can be successfully generated out from using WaveFunctionCollapse.
So the question is, all the examples so far have used very small examples, or very small input images. And actually that touches on the research I'm working on right now, which is helped, first off, because recently there's been a 20 times speed up in the implementation. So some people have gone in and improved the algorithm so it's faster. And then I'm looking at integrating it with other constraint solvers to get a much bigger input and use some machine learning to do some interesting things with how you train the example image. So stay tuned.
All right, thank you very much, Isaac. All right. Oh, there we go. Let's see, pause, reset. Hey, Melanie, you want to come up and kind of get us onto the next slides? I'm sort of like not quite sure what to do. So anyway, so our, I guess while they're setting up, I'll introduce the next speaker. So our next speaker is Max Kreminski, another PhD student here at UC Santa Cruz. He's going to be talking about what character generation, right? And story.
That is correct. Yeah.
Storylets. Okay. Anyway, so this is new work. I haven't heard this work before. So anyway, I'm really curious to hear what this is about. So.
Cool. Thank you. So yeah, hi. As mentioned, my name is Max Kreminski, and today I am going to be talking about proceduralizing character development with parametrized storylets. So I'm working on this game called Starfighter. I was actually also showing it here today at the Sammy showcase. You can go upstairs to check it out at the very end if you manage to catch me before we pack things up. It's a game in which you're the captain of a small spaceship, the titular Starfighter, and you have to take on these sort of odd jobs, frequently of dubious legality for pay. It's heavily inspired by things like Cowboy Bebop or Firefly, or sort of the off-screen implied lives of characters on the Millennium Falcon in Star Wars. But not in so much as it's about the flashy flying around in spaceships part, but more about the way in which it's about the gradually evolving character dynamics between the crew. So it's really a game about these sort of small, cozy, personal, slice-of-life stories that just so happen to be set in space. This is complicated in Starfighter by the fact that the entire Starfighter universe is procedurally generated, and this includes the people you can recruit to join your crew, all the other characters you interact with at various points along the way. So a character in Starfighter isn't really like, you know, a charismatic human actor being fed lines by a professional human screenwriter. They don't even have faces right now. Like, they're just a bundle of name and traits and some little pieces of data about them. So basically, this is similar to like in Dwarf Fortress or FTL, Faster Than Light, or any number of other similar games. And importantly, even the name and the traits that you have for the characters aren't really, they're not hand-selected by a human. They're randomly slapped together from a pool of possibilities. So they don't really hang together necessarily in any coherent way. So here's the challenge. How, for a game like Starfighter, do we make characters that audiences can care about? And yet that question for procedurally generated characters isn't really all that different from the question of how do we storytellers make people care about fictional characters in general? So one of the answers here is character development, obviously. Audiences really like to see characters grow and change, especially central characters, and especially in ways that make sense over time. They even like to be surprised once in a while if their character's development is going in a different path than they might expect, or if they see characters overcoming flaws that once defined them, or stuff like that. So how do we introduce character development into Starfighter? The naive approach here is to just handwrite some compelling character arcs, like one at a time, and randomly assign each character that we generate one of these arcs. The main issue here is that if players play for long enough, they're eventually going to sort of go through the entire pool of content, the entire pool of character arcs that exist, and see every one of these at least once. Then there will be no more element of surprise, basically. Players will feel as though they've completely exhausted the possibility space of arcs that they can see in the game, and there's also an additional issue of authoring. So if I want to write more character arcs for characters in Starfighter, I have to go through using this approach and write out a whole entire arc every time. It has to be sort of an entire from start to finish arc, and there's no modularity here. You can't really reuse parts of one arc within another, for instance. You can't sort of mix and match parts of two distinct arcs to create a new hybrid arc or anything like that. So let's go back to our influences, things like especially episodic sci-fi stories like Cowboy Bebop, Firefly, stuff like that, for some more inspiration. See, Starfighter sort of already has this naturally emerging episodic structure to it. When you're traveling between systems, the time you spend in a single system more or less constitutes a single episode in the mind of the player. So the shows that I'm talking about obviously use a lot of different storytelling techniques, but let's focus in on a few of them in particular that happen to be useful for our purposes here. Number one of these is character focus, and this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's when, as the authors of the show or as the scriptwriters of the show or whatever, we take a singular character and we put them into the spotlight for some period of time. This can be for a single episode, it can be for a series of several episodes in a row. For really long-running shows, it can be even like a whole arc that spans multiple seasons even. There's also relationship focus, which is pretty closely related to character focus. It's not just when you focus on one character, but when you focus on a pair of characters or a small group of characters and the ways that they relate to one another. Number three is hidden backstories. So this is when we conceal some stuff about a character, sort of hide it from the audience for a while, and this often involves stuff they've done in the past or some secret identity questions or stuff like that. And then we can reveal it later, which often provokes a moment of realization in the audience. So you can go, oh, now that this information has been revealed, I can see finally why this character did that thing that might not have made a whole lot of sense otherwise. Number four is foreshadowing, which is, again, pretty straightforward. This is just when we hint at or suggest things that might happen in the future. And number five is callbacks, which is sort of the opposite of foreshadowing. It's when we deliberately refer back to things that happened in the past. So let's look at an example character arc of the kind we might want to see in Starfighter. We've got a crew member, Alex, who has no particular interest in or aptitude for fighting. Alex develops a deep friendship with Morgan, who's another member of the crew. So you've got these two characters that are in this relationship. That's pretty good so far. One day, the crew gets in a bar fight, and Morgan is badly injured. Alex feels bad about having been unable to help in the bar fight and resolves to learn how to fight effectively. Eventually, the crew picks up a passenger who's good at fighting, who offers to mentor Alex. And after a while, they drop the passenger off at their destination, but Alex has learned enough in the process to keep learning how to fight and training on their own. Eventually, the crew gets in another bar fight, but this time Alex participates effectively, and the crew manages to win easily without sustaining any serious injuries. So this isn't like great literature or anything, but it's something that's interesting enough to hold my attention. How could we implement this? And more importantly, how could we implement a system that knows how to implement stories like this? And one way is to break this arc down into a series of storylets. So time for a quick digression. What exactly is a storylet that I keep talking about? And the term storylet is borrowed from Fallen London. This is a Fail Better Games game. It's been used in pretty much all the Fail Better stuff since then. It's essentially a self-contained chunk of story that has both preconditions and effects, at least as I define it here. Preconditions check the game state to determine whether this particular storylet can currently be shown to the player. So in Fallen London, we have this example of like, each of these storylets is unlocked by having certain characteristics as a player. You have to have numerical stats that are above a certain value. And if you have the right levels of stats, you can unlock certain storylets and play through them. And effects are the other side of this. They're the things that modify the game state when you pass through a storylet. So this could be if the storylet is sort of internally branching and allows players to make choices. It could be based on player choices that they've made, or it could just be you always have these same effects every time you play through this. So in Fallen London, you can see that there's sort of this list of storylets that the players are presented with, and they can see all of the storylets that are currently available to them and pick one to play for themselves. Starfighter works a little bit differently in this regard because Starfighter doesn't actually allow players to pick from the list of storylets they can play through. Instead, it basically is looking at the game state and choosing the next storylet based on sort of this weighted random selection from this massive pool of storylets at its disposal. Starfighter also introduces a bit of a twist on the basic definition of storylets that I just used here. So this is an example of a Starfighter storylet. It's actually a pretty simple one. And this is actually a pretty generic storylet too. It's got these very sort of generic fallbacky conditions that we'll talk about in a little bit. Starfighter storylets, importantly, are parametrized. And this means that in addition to normal preconditions, they also have these sort of cast slots that have to be filled. So this can be, for instance, by characters who meet certain preconditions themselves. So we might write a storylet that requires a certain character who's a mechanic, for instance. Or it might be more specific. It might require two characters who are in a relationship with one another, or one character who hates another, or any combination of like possible relationships, character traits, all that stuff. This allows a single storylet to be reused over and over again for different characters. Now, this particular storylet, like I said, is sort of a basic fallback one, and that means that its conditions are so generic as to be applicable in almost any set of situations. We actually only need to have, it looks like, 2 crew members, one of whom is not the first one. So, yeah. So how does this example, the character arc we just looked at, break down into parametrized storylets in a system like Starfighter's? So initially, we generate Alex with this sort of hidden potential. This is tying back to the hidden backstory stuff that I talked about a little bit ago. So this is a trait that's present from the moment of the character's birth, that is to say the moment at which they're first generated, that says that this hidden potential that Alex would basically be good at fighting if they ever tried it, but they've had no real motivation or no interest in doing it yet. This also is, importantly, not immediately exposed to the player in any way. This allows us to do things that appear to be foreshadowing, even though this character's destiny is sort of like built in from the start. We know that this character's, from the system's perspective, will always be sort of following along a certain character arc, or at least following along parts of a certain character arc, but the player doesn't importantly know that at the start. So at some point, the game's drama manager decides that it's Alex's turn to receive character focus. This might be because they've been out of focus for a while. It might be because something else has happened that sort of makes the story turn towards including Alex in more events, stuff like that. And this basically just means that events involving them are more likely to come up. The weighted random selection favors events that involve Alex in some way. So Alex's hidden potential is awakened by an inciting incident. This can be the bar fight gone bad or Morgan is injured. At this point, we upgrade the hidden potential to a desire. So Alex wants to learn how to fight effectively at this point. And this particular inciting incident might even be more likely to take place if the relationship between Alex and Morgan is currently in focus, in addition to or in opposition to Alex alone being in focus. The system is then allowed to pick storylets in which Alex's desire is upgraded again to a beginner level aptitude. This is because the preconditions are now fulfilled to pick sort of like next level storylets along this progression path for this character. By this point, Alex has probably fallen out of focus. So the drama manager will be always trying to sort of keep the player's attention. It'll switch focuses around every once in a while. It probably has a built-in notion of episodic structure where it's trying to decide what's the focus of this episode and sort of trying to keep the player interested that way. But Alex's story can continue even when it's in the background. So maybe some more chances for Alex to improve their fighting skills come up. You might see a martial arts dojo in one of the systems you're visiting. Alex might practice on their own while they're traveling between systems. All these things could advance their aptitude in various ways. And once Alex is better at fighting, if they get involved in another fight, the game might then be able to detect that this fight is similar to their arc's inciting incident and adjust the conditions of that fight to make it even more similar, which sort of creates a deliberate callback to the inciting incident of their whole character arc in the first place. The key here is that because this arc is split into parametrized storylets, any one part of it could have easily been swapped out for a bunch of possible alternatives, but the arc as a whole would still work. You can easily imagine that if the crew hadn't got involved in that particular bar fight, or if Morgan hadn't been injured in the fight, or if Alex and Morgan hadn't been close friends, or any number of other things, the system wouldn't have picked that particular event as the inciting incident for Alex's character arc. Instead, it would have picked a totally different inciting incident instead. So maybe your crew was in debt and got into a scuffle with a debt collector instead of getting into a bar fight. Or maybe Alex saw a really impressive martial arts demonstration while you were visiting a certain system, or something like that. And then, if Alex's inciting incident had been different, the second bar fight at the end of Alex's arc might have been different too. It might well have ended up being a different kind of event that better calls back to the initial inciting incident of this arc. So basically, each individual storylet doesn't really care about how you got here. It only cares about whether its own preconditions are met or not. From an authoring perspective, this is pretty great because it means you can write these little tiny modular units of content and then allow the game to figure out for you how exactly to slap them together in appropriate ways. You don't have to write each storylet with a notion of what comes before and after it. You just have to sort of allow it to fit into these fluid, rigid, non-rigid, flexible continuity or progression structures. This also allows us to, as authors, incrementally add new storylets to the content pool without breaking anything. So we can add new storylets basically one at a time without having to write a whole new character arc from scratch as a single unit. The game sort of becomes this vessel or container into which we can freely pour more story units as this sort of like liquid. To conclude, I should probably say that most of this is speculative still. The basic system of parametrized storylets that I'm talking about here is present in the current version of Starfighter, the one that you can play upstairs, but I haven't nearly authored enough content yet to see whether some of the bigger ideas here really pan out in practice. So for instance, I talked about the drama manager knowing which characters are in focus or having a notion of which relationships or whatever is in focus right now. That's not actually in the game at all. There are things that are related to some of the stuff I talked about here, but for the most part, I just need to sit down and author a whole bunch of content to see if these ideas work in practice. All the same, it seems to me from my basic investigations here that parametrized storylets are this sort of really solid basic structure for procedural narrative of this kind. And this is especially true when we want to make use of storytelling techniques that are borrowed from other forms of media. This is something we often want to do. It's something we actually want to do a lot of the time. So on that note, here's a few final takeaways for developers of interactive story games, myself included. Number one is that storytelling techniques from other forms of media are powerful. People have been telling stories for a long time, and we should probably be looking at what they're doing and learning from it as developers of interactive story systems. Number two is that many of our problems as interactive storytellers, like getting audiences to care about characters, aren't actually unique to interactive media or to procedurally generated characters or anything like that. Number three is that by encoding some knowledge about how to tell stories into our systems, things like the storytelling techniques I was talking about at the very beginning, we can actually improve the kinds of stories our systems are able to tell. And number four is that we should be on the lookout for implementation techniques that allow us to readily borrow storytelling techniques from other forms of media, which is kind of a mouthful, but basically it justifies for me the choice of the parametrized storylets for this kind of storytelling, because it seems like they're a really good fit for the kind of episodic storytelling techniques I'm trying to model. Which you might have noticed since I'm currently sitting here giving a talk about that. But whether or not you agree with me on that count, I think this meta-level point still applies. And the systems we should pick should be sort of suited to the implementation of the kinds of things we want to steal from other forms of media. So you can find me at any of these places if you want to chat with me about this stuff. You can go to the link at the bottom if you want to play the game. Thank you.
Questions?
So yeah, I mean, the storylet idea seems like it makes a lot of sense, especially in this context and thinking about procedural stories. I'm just curious if you have run into, you mentioned Fall in London, right? I think it was the, as having a kind of a storylet idea. Have you run into other kind of examples of places where people have been kind of thinking along these lines of breaking down stories like this?
Yeah, definitely. So the question was basically about, are there other games besides Fall in London and the sort of Fail Better Games series that use storylets or that break down stories in similar ways? And the answer is definitely yes. I can't think of a whole lot of specific examples right now. I've been playing a lot of Cultist Simulator lately, and that seems to use a very similar structure in some ways, in that you have to have these certain cards that you can use to unlock other cards that sort of do things. And I think Reigns probably uses a similar structure on the back end. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that seems familiar. And like I said, a whole bunch of things, especially in recent years, it feels like have been moving in this direction, just because it's a very appropriate structure for games that allow you to do a lot of different things and allow the content pool to be expanded very gradually.
All right, let's thank Max again. No, they work sort of like at 6:15. I think they need to do a little other side up first. Yeah, so I just want to say.
Oh, I can't see them? Oh, can I see them here?
It's just kind of like hard because it's like such an angle
Oh,
to see. So it
can it be mirrored? Mirrored is better.
All right, so the final talk in this session is by one of my PhD students, Lucas Ferreira, and he kind of started with this idea of, like, what if there was a soundtrack to your life? Like how would you go about procedurally generating that? And okay, our lives are complex, so maybe we'll focus down on something a little bit less complex than the full complexity of our lives. So I'll let Lucas tell you more about that.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, again, good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm here to talk about my PhD project, and we call it Generative Soundtracks for Oral Storytelling. And I'm a person who truly believes that music can make every experience better, especially games. And tabletop games are games that don't have music when you buy them, and a lot of people who think like me, they actually add music to their gameplay experiences as well. And this project is about making it for them, but instead of selecting music from a playlist, we are actually interested in generating new music based on their experience and see that how changes the experience. And we hope that would improve their experience, and especially if you have a system that does that in real time and they somehow can interact with it. So to start talking about this, I want to show you a video of a dungeon master telling a story without any music, and then I'm going to show the same video of the same story with music.
There's a white flash. Suddenly, you find yourself no longer in that blank, dark sewer. Now, you are standing in a field. Quite a pretty field. The sun's shining, and there is that scent of fresh grass that wafts up from the field.
Anyways, sorry for the beginning. I hope you've heard the beginning, but so let me show you the same story now with music.
As the cultist leader drives the dagger into the man's heart, there's a white flash. And suddenly, you find yourself no longer in that dank, dark sewer. Now, you are standing in a field. Quite a pretty field. The sun is shining, and there is that scent of fresh grass that wafts up from the.
So I hope with that example you could catch how much music can improve certain storytelling experiences. And this system and this project is about doing that. And so we envision this as a system that could potentially augment players' experiences with generative soundtracks. But considering that you have a system where people can interact with it, we can also
And if there is a system that listens to people and react to their speech to create music, this could also be seen as a system that supports music composition through speech. So people, instead of like passively actually interacting with the system through speech, they could actually change their speech, maybe change their voice tone, maybe through change the content of their speech, they could also control the music, and that could be the end goal of the system instead of actually just being something that passively creates soundtracks for them. And if you think this to if you generalize this system, it could also be applied to other type of creative writing, like novels, poems, and movie scripts, because speeches can be transcribed to text, and if you analyze their speech, not only the audio signal, but the the content of the speech, you also can do this to other types of media. So how do we do that? How do we planning to do that? So this is a work in progress, but the way we see this is we have some sort of device that listens to people, and somehow it extracts data from that speech. It could be either, let's say, audio or text, and then retrieving this information, then reacts to that or generates music based on the information it retrieved from the speech. So okay, it sounds simple like that, right? But of course it's not. So let's start talking about, first of all, what is the functions of soundtracks in media in general. So we can use soundtracks for many reasons. And one of them is setting the mood, for example. So let's say you have a horror movie and you just add on top of it, let's say a funny little song played with a kazoo. That would probably sound kind of comic, right? So that's the power of the music. It would just change the tone of that scene to a funny scene just through music. It can also definitely hide in emotions. Let's say Titanic, for example. You have a couple like looking at the ocean. There's this very dramatic scene there just to add that more romance or hope to a scene. And it can also propel actions. Take, for instance, Fast and Furious. Like you have those scenes where there's that cars, you have like wheels spinning very, very fast, and they have a song that matches the pattern of the rhythm of that wheel spinning. So then you connect better to the action. It can definitely also provide contextual clues, like for example in the Lord of the Rings. Every time Sauron shows up, there is a leitmotif or a little melody that it's played. So then you as a spectator, you know that Sauron is there or is coming. So we start exploring this problem through the lenses of hiding emotions. So we think that if you want to implement something that generates soundtracks, making it general enough to fit all those or to perform all these functions would be too hard. So we start with this first one. So what we're trying to do here, then in a more formal way, is create a system that composes soundtracks. And here I add this in the style of John Williams' classic types of soundtracks, like from Jaws, for example, or Star Wars, or this kind of like orchestrated type of soundtracks. And to hide an emotion of a story using, and here is the first type of method we're trying to explore, which is a state space search method that develop musical motifs into phrases. I'm going to talk more about motifs and phrases. Those are music theory concepts, but that's how we're planning to develop the soundtracks initially. So this is a figure of how we envision the system right now. So we have these auditory sensors which transform the speech into some data, again, like either as audio or as text. And then this performs some sentiment analysis that provides some values of emotion. And here, for example, I'm showing a model that has two values, which is valence and arousal, so V and A. And then this goes to a search method that has a motif library, which I'm going to explain later. And at the end, what the system generates are musical phrases, which again, I'm going to also explain right now. So motifs are the smallest structural unit that you see in a piece of music. And in this example here, this is from the Indiana Jones theme. And this is pretty much like la, 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 la. And from this little piece, you can create an entire theme, and by just developing it. So let's take a look at the first phrase of the Indiana Jones theme, right? So here's the motif highlighted, and you can transform it a little bit. So if you look at the very first two notes of the motif, you see the same two notes here, but they are just like down now, one stave. And then, and also the third note is increased, so then you remove the last two ones. And so on and so forth. Here you have the same initial structure as well, same durations, but they are just like now played up. And here you see the same structure again. So you can create this sense of like new, from initial idea, you can create new musical content just by developing and applying like small transformations to the rhythm or to the intervals of the motif. So we borrowed this idea to start creating generative soundtracks. So going deeper into the details of the system, so you get this emotion from the story as input, again, with two, you can imagine as two float values, for example. And then this is used to query from a library of those motifs. And the idea is that you're going to have a library of annotated motifs according to emotions. So you're going to ask people to annotate this, let's say, according to this model. And we hope that by having a large enough library that cover at least most of the common emotions in movies or in the game, for example, we could develop them and then have new ideas from this emotion. So this goes so this becomes, when you retrieve this motif from the library, becomes the initial state of a search method. And then this search method develops this motif into different phrases. So applying transformations to them. So the library could be created manually or procedurally. We are planning to investigate both of them because so manually we could just ask or we can ask musicians to compose a set of motifs, and procedurally we can also generate a bunch of them randomly, sampling durations and pitches from some structure, from intervals, from chords or scales. And this might change, for example, how human-like this type of music, the type of music that are generated at the end is. But in both cases, you have to annotate the motifs according to, in this case, we are using the circumplex mode of emotion, which has these two values, violence and arousal. So the search is formally defined as, again, as I said, a base motif starting from the beginning. The successor functions are just motif transformations. Like, for example, you can change one interval of the motif, like play it up or down. You can increase the length of a certain note or the duration of a certain note. And the goal is to find a new variation of this motif with the same thematic idea and emotion. So the idea here is that to create a phrase, you get one motif. You run this search, let's say, 3 or 4 times. You get 3 or 4 variations of your motif. And then you play them in order, and that should create a new phrase. The problem is that the phrases, they have to feel that they have a beginning and end, a middle and an end. So we also have to, in the search, we have to take care of like what is the structure of this phrase. So I'd like to show some preliminary results of phrases that we generated using an exhaustive search. Let me. Wait. Oops. Let me start again. You could hear that there was an initial idea that was repeated, and this was pretty much the chord of C minor. I started sampling notes from the chord of C minor with some random durations, and then I just, through the search, I had a goal of creating variations that had completely different durations from each other. So then you hear a new idea every time the same structure is played, the same motif is played again. And I'm gonna show another one. So this one is from the same chord. So this one is from the same chord. Oh. Sorry. So that previous one was also created from the chord of C minor, very simple 3 notes. But it has a more complex rhythm, so it was definitely, there was more notes there. It probably gives some more feeling of tension. But what's important to notice here is that all the phrases, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You feel that they finish, right? They start and then they finish somewhere. So this is something that I was working, this was the current status of this work. I was trying to make sure that all the phrases, they follow this structure, and we could do that through adding this idea of cadences in the search. And later, I'm just gonna show now a different motif that has a different type of emotion for me, at least. Okay, so yeah, this is created from a different chord. It definitely sounds probably more intriguing, or is not very stable, or very actually a little less consonant. So from this now, we want to actually start creating a library that represents several different emotions, and then apply this to actually implement this entire pipeline of picking from a text that has annotated emotions, picking this over time, and then creating these phrases and playing it as people are not playing the game, but like just reading a story, for example, or watching a video from that game, and then see how it performs. So that was it. Thank you very much, and I would like to take questions and answer questions if you have any.
All right, I think we have time for one question.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, since what you're trying to do is like you're starting with like a short motif and like building on that, then maybe like the wave function collapse thing, like I don't know, just kind of a thought that crossed my mind. Maybe it might not work good for like having to have that kind of progression of like a beginning, a middle, and end.
Yes, maybe we could talk more, but I'm not very familiar with actually how wave function collapse works. But to the extent that I know, it works with this kind of 2D patterns, right? And you explore the 2D structure of an image, then that's how you can create that thing. Music's more like a linear, dependent structure, so I don't know if that would work very well, but it's maybe worth exploring.
But somebody sent a poetry generator, so linear sequences of text with some, even some constraints, so there are several words down.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I sort of was reminded of this just a few days ago myself.
Oh, that's pretty cool, yeah.
Anyway, so, I don't know, in Mythbusters language, I'm plausible. All right, let's thank Lucas again. All right, for those of you who are watching on the internet, thank you very much for tuning in. That was our final presentation for the day. And again, hope you enjoyed the presentations. That's all. Yay.